Some people forget the moment that changed a life, others build their entire future around it. The crystal chandeliers scattered soft light across the grand ballroom, reflecting off polished marble floors and glasses filled with sparkling champagne, the kind that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and yet none of it held Daniel Whitmore's attention, not tonight, not anymore, because across the room, standing quietly near the edge of a towering column as if she didn't belong there, was a woman he had never been able to forget, even after all these years, even after everything he had built, and for a moment, the noise of the gala, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the polite conversations of people who had never worried about rent or medical bills, faded into something distant and hollow as his breath caught in his chest, because it couldn't be her, and yet it was, or at least it looked like her, the same soft features now worn by time and exhaustion, the same quiet dignity in the way she stood, holding a small boy's hand as he clung to her side, his little sneakers scuffing nervously against the marble floor, and Daniel's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass as a memory pushed forward without permission, uninvited but unstoppable, something fragile and distant and powerful all at once, something he had buried beneath years of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, and then the glass slipped, tilting just enough for a drop of amber liquid to spill over the rim and land on his cuff. But he didn't notice, because all he could see was her, and all he could feel was the echo of a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade, soft and steady and impossibly kind, telling him something he had needed more than food or shelter or anything money could ever buy. And just like that, the man who could command entire companies with a single word found himself unable to move, unable to speak, rooted in place like the boy he used to be, the boy no one had noticed. The boy who had been invisible until one small act changed everything, and across the room, Emily Carter shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the worn strap of her purse on her shoulder, as she scanned the crowd with quiet uncertainty, clearly uncomfortable among the tailored suits and effortless elegance, her coat simple, her heels slightly scuffed, her expression polite but guarded as if she had learned the hard way that rooms like this rarely welcomed people like her, and yet she stood there anyway, because sometimes life didn't give you the option to stay where you felt safe. Sometimes you had to step into places that reminded you just how far you were from where you thought you'd be, and beside her, her son tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering something that made her kneel down just long enough to brush his hair back and smile, a small, tired smile that carried more warmth than anything else in the entire room, and that was when Daniel's chest tightened again, sharper this time, because that smile, it was the same, unchanged by years or hardship, the same quiet reassurance she had given him once, long ago, when he had nothing and no one, and suddenly the distance between past and present collapsed into a single fragile thread, and he knew, with a certainty that didn't need logic or confirmation, that this was not coincidence, that the universe did not rewrite moments like this without reason, and somewhere beneath the weight of his success, beneath the reputation and the expectations and the carefully constructed life he had built, there was still that boy, still listening, still remembering, still holding on to the one moment that had taught him he mattered, and now, standing only 30 feet away, was the person who had said it first, the person who had no idea what she had done. And as Emily rose to her feet again, gently taking her son's hand, unaware of the storm of memory unfolding just across the room, Daniel finally took a step forward, then another, each one heavier than it should have been. Because this wasn't just a meeting, this wasn't just recognition. This was something far deeper, something unfinished, something that had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for years, and as the crowd shifted around him, parting just enough for him to see her clearly, he realized something that no amount of wealth had ever been able to give him before, something simple and undeniable, that sometimes the most important person in your life is the one who never knew they changed it at all. Daniel stopped 3 steps away from her, close enough now to see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes and the careful way she held herself, as if she had learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms that were not built for her, and for a moment he said nothing, because every version of this meeting he had imagined over the years had never prepared him for the reality of standing in front of her again. Not as the boy she once helped, but as a man whose name echoed across headlines and boardrooms, And yet somehow none of that mattered, not when she looked at him with polite confusion instead of recognition, not when her gaze carried no trace of the moment that had defined his entire life. And it was that absence that struck him the hardest, sharper than any rejection could have been, because it confirmed something he had never allowed himself to consider, that to her, it had just been an ordinary day. A small act, something forgettable, while to him, it had been everything. And Emily noticed him then, her posture straightening slightly as she shifted her son behind her just a little, protective without being obvious, her voice gentle but cautious as she spoke. "Excuse me, can I help you?" And the simplicity of the question almost made him smile, because she had no idea who he was, not in the way the rest of the room did. Not in the way people usually approached him with rehearsed admiration or careful calculation. She saw only a stranger standing too close, and for the first time in years, Daniel found himself unsure of how to answer, because the truth felt too large, too complicated to fit into a polite introduction. So he did what she expected, or at least what made sense in that moment. He gave a small nod and said, "I believe we have met before," and Emily blinked, her brows drawing together slightly as she searched his face with genuine effort. Not the kind of polite pretending he was used to, but real consideration, as if she did not want to dismiss him too quickly, and after a few seconds she shook her head softly, offering an apologetic smile that carried no trace of recognition. "I am sorry, I do not think so, we just met," and there it was, the sentence that separated their worlds completely, the quiet line between memory and oblivion, and Daniel felt it settle in his chest, heavy but undeniable, because she meant it, she truly believed it, and for a brief second, something inside him wavered. A fragile hesitation that questioned whether he should say anything more, whether it was fair to bring back something she had clearly left behind. But then his eyes dropped, almost instinctively, and that was when he saw it, the thin bracelet wrapped around her wrist, simple and worn, its threads slightly faded with time but unmistakable in its pattern, a small detail that should not have survived years of hardship and change, and yet it had, quietly holding on to a piece of the past that she no longer remembered. And his breath caught again, softer this time, as the memory returned. With a clarity that felt almost unreal, the rain falling in uneven sheets, the cold pavement beneath him, the hunger that had made everything blur until the world had felt like something he was slowly disappearing from, and then her voice, steady and kind, breaking through the silence as she crouched beside him, holding out half of her sandwich as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if he mattered without needing to prove it. And he remembered how she had looked at him, not with pity, not with fear, but with something simple and powerful, something he had not known how to name back then, and maybe still could not fully explain now, but he had never forgotten it, not once, and standing here, years later, with everything he had built resting on decisions that traced back to that single moment, he realized that this was not about correcting her memory, this was about honoring it. About understanding what it meant that she could forget something that had shaped him so completely. And Emily shifted again, clearly uncertain now, her son peeking out from behind her leg with curious eyes, and she said gently, "Are you sure you have the right person?" And Daniel finally looked back at her, really looked, not as a memory, not as a symbol, but as the woman standing in front of him now. And there was something different, something quieter in his expression as he answered, almost carefully, as if he was choosing each word with intention, "I am sure," and the way he said it carried a weight she could not yet understand, but she felt it anyway, in the slight pause that followed. In the way the air between them seemed to shift just enough to make her wonder if this was not as simple as she thought, and somewhere deep inside him, Daniel made a decision he had not planned to make, not here, not tonight. Because some truths were not meant to be forced into a single conversation, some stories needed space to unfold, and as the noise of the gala slowly returned around them, filling in the silence that had stretched between their words, he took a small step back, just enough to give her room. Just enough to let the moment breathe, and said quietly, "Perhaps I will remind you someday," not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a promise, one that carried years of memory she had yet to rediscover. And as Emily watched him step away, her brows still slightly furrowed, her son tugging gently at her hand again, She could not explain why something about that encounter lingered, something subtle and unsettling and strangely familiar, like a feeling she had forgotten how to name. And for the first time that evening, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was not the first time their paths had crossed after all. The music resumed its gentle rhythm, but Emily could no longer hear it the same way, as if something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of the evening, something quiet but persistent that followed her even as she guided her son toward the refreshment table, her fingers tightening slightly around his small hand as she tried to focus on the simple task of pouring him a glass of water, because it should have been simple. Everything about this night was supposed to be simple: show up, smile politely, thank the organizer who had given her the last-minute catering job, and leave before anyone noticed she did not belong. But now there was a weight in her chest she could not explain, a subtle unease that lingered in the back of her mind like a word she almost remembered but could not quite reach, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, just once, just briefly, searching the crowd without meaning to, as if expecting to find him still watching her. But Daniel Whitmore was already gone from where he had been standing, absorbed back into the center of the room where people naturally gathered around him, drawn by something she did not yet recognize, and she exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if to clear the thought, because it did not make sense, none of it did, and yet the way he had said those words lingered, calm but certain, not the kind of certainty people used when they were mistaken, but something deeper, something that made her question herself in a way she was not used to. And beside her, her son tugged gently at her sleeve again, his voice soft and curious as he asked, "Mom, who was that man?" And Emily forced a small smile, brushing a strand of hair behind his ear as she answered, "Just someone who thought he knew me, sweetheart." But even as she said it, the words felt incomplete, as if she was convincing herself more than him, and across the room, Daniel stood surrounded by conversation that he barely registered, nodding at the right moments, offering polite responses when required, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of their brief exchange with a clarity that bordered on obsession, the way her voice had sounded, the way she had searched his face with honest effort, the way she had said they had just met without hesitation, and it should have been simple to accept. People forget, lives move on, moments fade. But this was not just a moment to him, it was the foundation of everything he had become, and he realized then that remembering her was not enough anymore. Not when she stood just a few steps away living a life that looked nothing like the one he had imagined she deserved, not when the quiet strength he had seen in her all those years ago was now carrying the weight of exhaustion and responsibility. And without drawing attention, he stepped away from the group, his movements smooth and unhurried, the way someone used to being watched learned to disappear in plain sight, and within minutes, he was in a quieter hallway just beyond the ballroom, his phone already in his hand as he made a call that would change the course of her life without her even knowing it, his voice low and controlled as he spoke. "I need everything you can find on Emily Carter, recent employment, address, family details." And there was a brief pause on the other end before his assistant responded with professional efficiency, "Of course, sir," and Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second before adding, "Keep it discreet, no direct contact, I do not want her alarmed," and when the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly, his reflection catching faintly in the polished glass of a nearby window, and for a moment, he saw both versions of himself at once. The man he had become and the boy he used to be, connected by a single memory that had never faded, and back. Inside the ballroom, Emily adjusted her coat as the evening began to wind down, quietly gathering her things with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from years of learning how to leave places quickly without drawing attention, and as she helped her son into his jacket, she felt it again, that strange pull, subtle but undeniable, and before she could stop herself, her fingers brushed lightly against the bracelet on her wrist. The old thread slightly rough beneath her touch, something she had worn for so long she rarely thought about it anymore, something that had simply always been there, and for a split second, an image flickered at the edge of her mind: rain, cold air, a feeling she could not quite place, but it vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only a faint echo behind, and she shook her head again, dismissing it as exhaustion, because there was no room in her life for half-memories and unanswered questions. Not when there were bills to pay and a child who depended on her. And yet, as she stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights stretching endlessly in front of her, she could not shake the feeling that something had just begun, something quiet and unseen. Something that would not stay buried no matter how much she tried to ignore it, and somewhere above the city, in an office that overlooked miles of glass and steel, a plan was already unfolding, carefully and deliberately, not to remind her of the past all at once, but to lead her back to it, piece by piece, until the moment she had forgotten found its way home again. Morning arrived without ceremony, the pale light slipping through thin curtains that did little to soften the small apartment's worn edges, and Emily was already awake before her alarm, lying still for a moment as she listened to the quiet rhythm of her son's breathing from the other room, the kind of silence that only existed in the brief space before the day began demanding everything from her again, and for a second, just a second, her mind drifted back to the night before, to the man who had looked at her as if she was something he had been searching for, and she exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temple as if she could push the thought away, because there was no time for distractions, not when the rent was due in 9 days and her hours at the diner had been cut again, not when reality had a way of reminding her exactly where she stood, and with a quiet resolve she sat up, pulling herself into motion. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led back to questions she could not answer, and in a different part of the city, several floors above streets already filling with traffic, Daniel stood by a wide glass window that stretched from floor to ceiling, the skyline sharp and clear in the early light, his reflection faint against the glass as he listened to his assistant's voice through the phone, steady and precise as she outlined everything she had gathered overnight. Emily Carter, age 29. Single mother, 1 child, 6 years old. Currently working part-time at a local diner and occasional catering jobs, previous employment inconsistent, gaps likely due to childcare, residential address confirmed. And Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing each detail not as data, but as pieces of a life he had never imagined for her, a life that did not match the quiet strength he remembered, and yet somehow made it even more real, more human, more fragile than the memory he had carried for years. And when his assistant paused, waiting for further instruction, he spoke without hesitation, set up a temporary accounting position through Whitmore Holdings, entry level, nothing that draws attention, and there was a slight pause before she responded, understood, should we contact her directly? And Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the thought behind it. No, he said quietly, make it look like she found it on her own, and the decision settled between them, simple on the surface but deliberate in its intent, because this was not about rescuing her, not about stepping into her life like a solution she had not asked for. It was about creating a path she could choose, something that respected the independence he had seen in her all those years ago. And across town, Emily was tying her son's shoelaces, her movements quick but gentle as she reminded him to stay close after school, her voice soft but firm, the way it always was when she balanced care with responsibility. And as she reached for her bag, something slipped from the side pocket, landing quietly on the worn wooden floor, and she paused, bending down to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the familiar texture of the small envelope she had not opened yet. Something she had received late the night before, slipped into her bag by one of the event organizers with a brief, distracted comment about job opportunities, and she had almost forgotten about it entirely. But now, standing there in the narrow space between routine and uncertainty, she hesitated for just a moment before opening it, her eyes scanning the simple printed details: temporary accounting position, flexible hours, location within walking distance, and she frowned slightly. Because it felt too convenient, too well timed to be coincidence, and yet she could not afford to question opportunity when it finally appeared, not when every dollar mattered. And behind her, her son's voice broke through her thoughts, asking if they were going to be late, and she folded the paper carefully, slipping it back into her bag as she forced a small, reassuring smile. No, sweetheart, we are right on time, even though something inside her felt slightly off, not wrong, just unfamiliar, like a door she did not remember opening. And as they stepped out into the cool morning air, the city already moving around them with quiet urgency, Emily could not shake the feeling that her life had shifted in a way she did not fully understand yet, while somewhere above it all, Daniel lowered his phone. Slowly, his reflection still faint in the glass, and for the first time in years, the decisions he made were not about growth or profit or strategy, but about something far more personal, something rooted in a memory that refused to stay in the past, and as he turned away from the window, there was a quiet certainty in his steps, because this was no longer about remembering her. It was about making sure that the kindness she had once given without hesitation would find its way back to her, not as repayment, but as something just as quiet, just as meaningful, something that would not demand recognition, only acceptance, even if she never knew where it came from. By the time Emily reached the address listed on the paper, the morning had already stretched into something heavier than she expected, the kind of day where every step felt like it carried more weight than usual, not because of the distance, but because of the quiet uncertainty sitting in her chest, and she slowed slightly as the building came into view. Her eyes tracing the clean lines of glass and steel that rose above the street with a quiet confidence that felt worlds away from anything in her daily life, and for a moment she hesitated at the corner, adjusting the strap of her bag as if giving herself a reason to pause, because places like this did not usually open their doors to people like her, not without questions, not without expectations she was not sure she could meet, and yet the paper in her hand said otherwise, and that alone was enough to push her forward, step by step, until she found herself standing just inside the lobby, the polished floor reflecting soft light. That made everything feel brighter, sharper, more defined than the world she had just walked out of, and she felt it immediately, the subtle shift in atmosphere, the quiet efficiency of people moving with purpose, the low hum of conversation that never rose too high, and for a second she wondered if she should turn around, if this had been some kind of mistake. But then her son's face flashed in her mind. The way he had smiled that morning without knowing how fragile things really were, and she straightened slightly, grounding herself in that thought before approaching the front desk, her voice steadied but careful as she spoke. "I am here about a temporary position," and the receptionist looked up with a polite, practiced smile, her fingers moving quickly across a keyboard before her expression softened just enough to signal recognition. "Of course, Ms. Carter, we have been expecting you." And the words landed with a quiet weight that Emily could not fully explain, because expecting her implied something intentional, something planned, and she felt that subtle unease again, the same one that had followed her since the night before. But there was no time to question it, not when opportunity rarely knocked twice, and within minutes, she was being guided through a series of hallways that felt both unfamiliar and strangely calm, as if the building itself had been designed to reassure rather than intimidate, and when she finally stepped into a small office, she found a woman already waiting, her posture relaxed, but professional, her voice warm as she introduced herself and began explaining the role in simple, clear terms: temporary accounting support, flexible hours, work that Emily not only understood but had once done with confidence before life had shifted her path. And as the conversation continued, something inside Emily began to settle, not completely, but enough to replace hesitation with a cautious sense of possibility. Because this was not charity, not the kind that came with unspoken expectations. This felt structured, intentional, something she could step into without losing the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. And across the city, Daniel sat at the edge of a long conference table, the usual flow of discussion continuing around him, numbers, projections, decisions that would affect people he would never meet, and yet his attention drifted again, not away from responsibility, but towards something that now carried equal weight. And when his phone buzzed softly against the table, he did not need to check the screen to know what it was, and when he did, the brief message confirmed it: "She has arrived. Everything is proceeding as planned." And for a moment Daniel allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, because this was not about control, not about shaping her life into something easier. It was about opening a door that had never been offered to her in the first place, and he knew that if she chose to walk through it, it would be because of her own strength, not because of anything he had done behind the scenes. And back in the office, Emily signed the final page with a steady hand, the pen moving across the paper with a quiet sense of determination that had carried her through years of uncertainty. and as she set it down, the woman across from her smiled gently, welcoming her in a way that felt sincere rather than rehearsed, and Emily nodded in return, her own smile smaller but real, because for the first time in a long while, something in her life had shifted in a direction she had not expected, something that did not feel like survival, but like possibility. And as she stepped back out into the hallway, the subtle hum of the buildings surrounding her once again, she reached down instinctively, brushing her fingers against the bracelet on her wrist, the worn thread grounding her in something familiar, and though she still did not understand why this opportunity had come so suddenly, or why the memory of a stranger's voice lingered just beneath her thoughts, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, something quiet but steady. Like the beginning of a path she had not realized she had been waiting for, while somewhere above it all, Daniel stood once more by the glass window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, and for the first time, the distance between who he had been and who he had become did not feel like something he had to reconcile, because the reason had finally found its way back into his life, even if she did not recognize it yet. The first day passed faster than Emily expected, not because the work was easy, but because it felt familiar in a way that stirred something she had not felt in years, a quiet confidence that surfaced each time she organized a ledger, balanced a column, or caught a small discrepancy before it became a problem, and with every task completed, she felt a subtle shift inside her. As if a part of herself she had set aside out of necessity was slowly returning, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, steady pieces that reminded her she had once been more than just someone trying to get through each day, and as the afternoon light softened through the tall windows, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes scanning the final numbers on her screen before saving the file, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to breathe, to recognize that this felt different, that this did not feel like survival, but like stability. Something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. And across the office, a few quiet conversations continued, coworkers moving with the same calm efficiency that had surrounded her since she arrived, and though she was still new, still adjusting, there was something about the environment that did not make her feel out of place, something that did not press against her the way other spaces often had, and she could not explain why. But it made her lower her guard just enough to settle into the rhythm of the day, and when her phone buzzed softly in her bag, she reached for it instinctively, her heart tightening for just a second until she saw her son's school name on the screen, and she answered quickly, her voice soft but alert, only to hear the reassuring tone of the office staff explaining a minor schedule change for pickup, nothing urgent, nothing wrong, and she nodded even though they could not see her, thanking them before ending the call, her shoulders relaxing as she exhaled slowly. Because even the smallest unexpected moment had the power to unsettle her now, and as she placed the phone back into her bag, her fingers brushed against the edge of the bracelet again, the worn thread catching slightly against her skin, and this time, she paused, her gaze lingering on it for just a second longer than usual, because something about the texture, the pattern, the quiet familiarity of it stirred a faint sensation she could not fully place, not a memory, not yet, but something close to it, something just beyond reach. And she frowned slightly, shaking her head as if to clear the thought, because there was no time to follow half-formed feelings when the day still had responsibilities waiting for her, and just as she turned back to her desk, a voice behind her spoke gently, "Ms. Carter," and she turned to find the same woman who had guided her earlier, her expression calm but thoughtful as she held a small folder. "We have reviewed your work from today, and I wanted to let you know that we are very impressed." And Emily blinked, a quiet surprise crossing her face because praise was not something she heard often, not in this way, not without hesitation or condition, and she nodded slowly, "Thank you, I just did what I could," and the woman smiled slightly, "There may be an opportunity to extend your position beyond temporary, if you are interested," and the words settled into Emily's mind with a weight she was not prepared for, because extension meant stability, stability meant possibility. And possibility was something she had learned not to expect too quickly, and for a moment, she did not respond, not because she did not want it, but because she needed to make sure it was real, and when she finally nodded again, her voice was quieter, more grounded. "I would like that," and as the woman stepped away, Leaving her with that single sentence echoing in her thoughts, Emily sat back down slowly, her eyes returning to the screen but not fully focusing, because something inside her had shifted again. Something that made her question how all of this had come together so suddenly, how doors that had been closed for so long were now opening without resistance. And somewhere high above the city, Daniel stood in silence, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular as the update reached him through a simple message: performance exceeds expectations, candidate recommended for extension. And he read it once, then again, not because he needed confirmation, but because seeing it written made something inside him settle, a quiet reassurance that this was not just a memory guiding his actions, but a reality unfolding in a way that honored who she was, not who he remembered. And as he placed the phone down, his reflection once again faint in the glass, he understood something with a clarity that had taken years to form, that the moment she had given him all those years ago had not been meant to be repaid in a single act. It was meant to be carried forward, quietly, steadily, in ways that allowed both of them to become who they were meant to be, even if she had forgotten where it all began. The days began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar to Emily, not because it was difficult, but because it was steady, and steadiness was something her life had not allowed in a long time. And each morning as she walked into the building, there was a quiet shift in the way she carried herself, subtle but real, her steps a little more certain, her shoulders a little less tense. As if she was slowly remembering how it felt to belong somewhere without having to prove it every second. And the work itself continued to unfold in ways that both challenged and reassured her, small problems that required focus, details that demanded precision, and she found herself leaning into it, not just completing tasks, but improving them, organizing systems that others had overlooked, catching patterns that saved time and reduced errors, and though she did not seek recognition, it began to find her anyway. In quiet acknowledgments, in the way people started coming to her desk with questions, trusting her judgment without hesitation, and it was in one of those moments, as she stood beside a colleague reviewing a report, that she felt it again, that faint pull at the edge of her awareness, the same one that had followed her since the night of the gala, subtle but persistent, and she paused for just a second, her fingers brushing lightly against the bracelet on her wrist as if grounding herself in something she could not yet explain, and the feeling passed, but not completely, leaving behind a quiet echo that lingered longer than before. And across the city, Daniel sat in a smaller office than the one he was known for, a space intentionally removed from the main executive floor, where observation was easier than attention, and on the screen in front of him there were no financial projections, no strategic reports, only a live internal feed of the accounting department, not focused on her directly, but enough to show movement, interaction, the way she carried herself within the environment he had created for her without her knowledge, and he watched not with control, but with quiet attention, noting the details that mattered, the way she approached problems, the way she listened before speaking, the way others responded to her presence. And there was a small shift in his expression when he saw it, the moment someone deferred to her judgment without question, because that was not something that could be given, it had to be earned, and she was earning it on her own, just as he had hoped, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, because this was what mattered, not the memory itself, but what had grown from it. And back in the office, Emily gathered her things as the day came to an end, her movements unhurried for once. Because she was not rushing to her second job tonight, the schedule shift allowing her to pick up her son earlier than usual, and the thought brought a small, genuine smile to her face, one that softened the edges of her exhaustion just enough to let something lighter through. And as she stepped out into the evening air, the city felt different somehow, not quieter, not slower, but less overwhelming, as if she was no longer standing outside of it looking in, but beginning to find her place within it. And when she reached the school, her son ran toward her with the same unfiltered joy he always carried, his small arms wrapping around her in a way that made everything else fall away for just a moment, and she held him a little tighter than usual, not out of fear, but out of something closer to gratitude, because for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was not just holding things together, she was building something, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. And as they walked home together, his hand slipping into hers without thought. She listened to him talk about his day, about small victories and tiny frustrations that felt enormous to him, and she responded with the same patience she always had. But there was something different beneath it now, something steadier. Something that made her words feel less like reassurance and more like truth. And later that night, after he had fallen asleep, Emily sat quietly at the small kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and she reached for the bracelet again, turning it slightly between her fingers as she studied it in the dim light, really looking at it for the first time in a long while, and this time. The flicker came back stronger, not a full memory, but a sensation, cold air. Rain, the faint echo of a voice, her own voice, younger, softer, saying something she could not fully hear, and she frowned, her breath catching slightly as she leaned back, because it felt important, not just familiar, but significant in a way she could not yet explain. And across the city, Daniel stood once again by the window, the lights below stretching endlessly into the distance, and though he could not see her, could not hear her thoughts, there was a quiet certainty in him that something had begun to shift, that the distance between memory and recognition was slowly narrowing, not because he forced it, but because some things were never truly forgotten, they only waited for the right moment to be felt again. The following morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath for something just beneath the surface, and Emily woke earlier than usual, not because she had to, but because her mind refused to stay at rest, the faint echo of that feeling from the night before still lingering in her chest, soft but insistent, like a memory that was no longer content to remain hidden. And she sat up slowly, her gaze drifting toward the bracelet resting loosely against her wrist, the worn thread catching the early light in a way that made it seem more significant than it had the day before, and for a moment she simply looked at it, not as something she had always worn, but as something that had a story she had not fully remembered, and as she traced its edges with her fingers, the sensation returned again, stronger this time, the chill of damp air against her skin, the faint sound of rain hitting pavement, and a voice, her own voice, softer, younger, saying something that made her chest tighten even now, something about not disappearing, about being seen, and her breath caught as she pulled her hand back slightly, the memory not complete, not clear, but no longer something she could dismiss as imagination, and she stood quickly, as if movement might steady her, as if focusing on the day ahead would push the feeling back into the background where it belonged. Because she did not have the space in her life for unanswered questions, not when everything was finally beginning to feel stable, and yet as she moved through her morning routine, getting her son ready for school, preparing breakfast, checking the time more often than necessary, there was a quiet distraction in her actions, a slight delay in her responses, as if part of her attention was still somewhere else, trying to reach something just beyond her grasp. And when she finally stepped outside, the air cool and fresh against her skin, she paused for just a second longer than usual, her eyes lifting toward the sky without knowing why, and somewhere deep inside, there was a recognition she could not explain, not yet, but it was there, waiting, and across the city, Daniel stood in a different part of the building than usual, not behind glass or screens, but in a quiet hallway just beyond the accounting department, his presence unnoticed by most. His steps measured and deliberate as he moved without drawing attention, because today was not about observation from a distance. Today was about something else, something closer, something that carried a weight he had not felt in years, and when he stopped just outside the open office space, he did not enter immediately, instead watching for a moment as Emily moved through her work with the same quiet focus he had come to recognize, her posture steady, her attention precise, and there was a subtle shift in his expression when he noticed the slight distraction in her movements, the way she paused for a fraction longer than usual, the way her hand drifted briefly to her wrist as if grounding herself. And he understood without needing confirmation, something was beginning to surface, not fully, not yet, but enough to change the rhythm of her thoughts, and it was in that moment that he made the decision to step forward, not as a distant presence, not as an unseen influence, but as himself. And when Emily looked up from her desk and saw him standing there, the same man from the gala, the same steady gaze, the same quiet certainty, her breath caught just slightly, not out of recognition, but because something about his presence now felt different, closer, more intentional, and she straightened instinctively, her voice calm but questioning as she said, "You again," and Daniel allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile, not one of confidence, but of understanding, as if he had expected this exact moment, and he nodded once before speaking, his voice low but clear. "I told you I would remind you someday," and there was something in the way he said it that made the air between them shift, subtle but undeniable. And Emily felt it immediately, that same pull from before stronger. Now more insistent, and she frowned slightly, her hand instinctively moving to the bracelet again as she searched his face, not just looking, but trying, really trying to find something familiar, something that would explain the feeling rising in her chest, and for a second, just a second, the image returned sharper than before. Rain, a figure sitting alone, her own hand reaching out, and she blinked. Her breath uneven as she shook her head slightly. "I do not understand," and Daniel stepped closer, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to be present, his gaze steady but gentle as he said quietly, "You do not have to remember everything at once," and the words settled into her with a weight that felt both comforting and unsettling, because they suggested something she had not yet accepted, that there was something to remember, something real, something that had been a part of her life whether she recalled it or not, and for the first time since all of this began, Emily did not dismiss it, did not push it away, because somewhere deep inside, something was beginning to align, not fully, not clearly, but enough to make her pause, enough to make her listen, and as the office continued around them, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in that small space, both of them stood there in a moment that was no longer about coincidence or confusion, but about something slowly returning to the surface, something that had never truly been lost, only waiting for the right moment to be seen again. Emily did not realize she had been holding her breath until she slowly let it out, the air between them feeling heavier now, not with tension, but with something deeper, something that carried meaning she could not yet fully grasp, and she looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at his face, but at the way he stood, the quiet stillness in his posture. The way his presence did not demand attention yet seemed to hold it effortlessly, and there was something familiar in that too. Not in detail, but in feeling, like a quiet recognition that lived somewhere beneath memory, and she shook her head slightly, her voice softer now, less defensive, more uncertain as she said, "Why do you keep saying that, as if I am supposed to remember something?" And Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not have the words, but because he understood that what she needed was not a rushed explanation, not a forced truth, but something she could reach on her own, and he took a small step back, giving her space without withdrawing completely, his voice steady as he said, "Because you already do, even if you do not realize it yet," and the simplicity of the sentence settled into her thoughts in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and she frowned slightly, her fingers tightening unconsciously around the edge of her desk as that same flicker returned, stronger now, clearer. And for a moment, the office around her seemed to fade just enough for something else to take its place, the sound of rain again, more distinct this time, the cold dampness in the air, the faint outline of a younger version of herself standing under a small awning, holding something in her hands, and her breath caught as she closed her eyes briefly, the image pulling at her with a quiet urgency. But it was still incomplete. Still just out of reach, and when she opened her eyes again, there was a different kind of awareness in them, something shifting, something beginning to connect, and she looked at him again, her voice barely above a whisper now, "Who are you?" And Daniel held her gaze without hesitation, not with the authority he carried in every other part of his life, but with something far more personal, something rooted in the boy he used to be, and he answered simply, "Someone you once helped." And the words landed with a quiet finality that made her chest tighten, not because she understood them fully, but because part of her did, part of her recognized the truth in them even without the details. And she stepped back slightly, her hand moving again to the bracelet, her fingers gripping it now as if it might anchor her to something real, something she could hold onto as the feeling inside her grew stronger, and across the room, a few co-workers glanced up briefly, sensing the shift in atmosphere without understanding it, before returning to their work, because Whatever was happening between them existed in a space that did not quite belong to the rest of the world, and Emily took a slow breath, trying to steady herself as she spoke again, her voice uneven but determined. I have helped a lot of people, small things, it does not mean anything, and Daniel's expression softened just slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding, because that was exactly what made it so powerful. And he nodded once before replying, it meant everything to me, and the weight of his words settled between them, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing more to say that would not rush what was already unfolding on its own, and Emily felt it then, more clearly than before, the edge of something breaking through, not a full memory, but a realization that whatever this was, it was not one-sided, it was not imagined, it was something real that had existed in her life whether she remembered it or not, and that realization alone was enough to shift something inside her, to make her stop resisting, to make her listen in a way she had not allowed herself to before, and Daniel saw it, the subtle change in her expression, the way her eyes no longer dismissed him, but searched, and he knew that the distance between past and present had narrowed again, not because he had forced it, but because it was ready, and as the moment stretched quietly between them, the noise of the office continuing around them as if nothing had changed, something had already begun to take shape, something that no longer depended on memory alone, but on recognition, on the quiet understanding that some connections do not fade. No matter how much time passes, they simply wait for the moment they can be seen again. Emily felt the words linger long after he spoke them, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they carried a quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss, and she stood there for a moment, her fingers still wrapped around the bracelet as if it was the only stable thing in a world that had suddenly begun to shift, and she looked down at it again, really seeing it now, not just as something she had always worn, but as something that had a beginning she could not fully remember. And her breath slowed as she closed her eyes, just for a second, allowing the feeling to come instead of pushing it away, and this time, the memory did not stay distant, it moved closer, clearer, the rain falling heavier now, the sound sharper, the air colder against her skin, and she saw it, not perfectly, not completely, but enough, a younger version of herself standing under a flickering streetlight, holding half of a sandwich wrapped in thin paper, her small hands slightly trembling from the cold, and in front of her, a boy sitting on the curb, his head lowered, his shoulders hunched as if the world had pressed down on him for too long, and her heart raced as the image sharpened, her own voice breaking through the sound of rain, gentle but firm, telling him something simple, something she had not thought about in years, something she had not realized she had ever said, "You matter, do not disappear," and her eyes opened suddenly, her breath uneven as she stepped back, the present rushing back around her, the office, the quiet movement of people, the soft hum of machines, but it all felt different now, as if it was layered over something deeper, something she could no longer ignore, and she looked at him again, really looked, and this time, it was not confusion in her eyes, but something else, something fragile and uncertain and slowly becoming clear, and her voice came out softer than before, almost hesitant as she said, "That was you," and Daniel did not move, did not speak immediately. Because the moment was not his to control, it was hers to reach, and when he finally nodded, it was slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something that had always been true, and Emily felt something shift inside her, something that was not just memory, but understanding, because she remembered now, not every detail, not every moment, but enough to know that it had been real, that it had happened, and that the boy she had barely thought about again had carried that moment with him in a way she never had. And she shook her head slightly, her voice almost incredulous. "I was just a kid, I did not do anything important," and Daniel's expression changed then, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a way that made the truth in his next words impossible to question. "You did," and he took a small step closer, his voice steady but quieter now, not for effect, but because the weight of what he was saying did not need to be raised, it carried itself. "You gave me a reason to stay." And the simplicity of that sentence settled into her in a way that made everything else fall away for just a moment, because she could feel it, the truth of it, not in logic, but in the way it connected to the memory she had just touched, and she looked down again, her hand loosening slightly on the bracelet, her fingers tracing its edge with a new awareness, because now it was not just something she had always had, it was something tied to a moment she had forgotten but that had never truly left her, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering as something inside her softened, not completely, not all at once, but enough to make space for what this meant, and around them, the office continued, unaware, unchanged, but for Emily, something fundamental had shifted, something that made the present feel connected to the past in a way she had not expected, and she looked at him again, her voice quieter now, not guarded, not uncertain, but thoughtful. "Why did you not tell me before?" And Daniel held her gaze, his answer coming without hesitation, because it would not have meant the same, and she understood that too, not fully, but enough, because remembering something on her own felt different than being told, it felt real. It felt earned, and as the moment settled between them, no longer fragile but still unfolding, Emily realized something she had not expected, that the small act she had forgotten had not disappeared, it had lived on, quietly, shaping a life she was only now beginning to see, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider what that might mean, not just for him, but for her, because if something so small could carry that kind of weight, then maybe her life, the one she had been struggling to hold together, held more meaning than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Emily remained still long after his words settled between them, not because she did not understand, but because she was beginning to understand too much, and it came in layers, quiet realizations unfolding one after another as she stood there in the middle of a life she had always seen as ordinary, suddenly faced with the truth that something she had once done without thinking had carried a weight she had never imagined. And she looked down again at the bracelet, her fingers tracing it slowly. Now, not out of habit, but with intention, because it was no longer just a piece of thread, it was a connection, a reminder of a version of herself she had forgotten but that had never truly disappeared, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering as the tension she had carried since the gala began to shift into something else, something quieter, something closer to acceptance, and when she looked back up at Daniel, there was a different kind of steadiness in her eyes, not confusion, not resistance, but something more grounded, more aware, and she spoke softly, almost as if she was thinking the words through as she said them. "I did not know," and Daniel nodded. Slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because that was exactly what made it matter, that she had not known, that she had not expected anything in return, that the moment had been given freely without the weight of intention, and that was what had made it real, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was no need to fill the space with more words. Not when everything that needed to be understood was already there between them, and Emily felt something else then. Something she had not expected, not just the realization of what had happened, but the awareness of what had followed, because if that moment had meant so much to him, if it had shaped the path that led him here, then the distance between them was not just about time, it was about everything that had come after, everything he had built, everything she had struggled through, and she glanced around the office briefly, taking in the space with new eyes, not as a place she had been lucky to enter, but as something connected to him, to the life he had created, and the thought settled quietly in her mind before she looked back at him, her voice more certain now, but still gentle. "Did you do this?" And the question hung between them, simple but carrying layers of meaning, and Daniel did not look away, did not deflect, because he understood what she was asking, not just about the job, but about everything that had shifted since the moment they met again, and he answered honestly, but carefully. "I made sure the door was open," and Emily's expression changed slightly, not with anger, not immediately, but with something more complicated, something that balanced gratitude and uncertainty, because she understood the intention behind it, but it also made her question the ground she was standing on, and she took a small step back, her voice quieter now, but firmer. "I need to know that I earned this," and the words came from a place deeper than pride, deeper than independence. They came from the life she had built through effort and sacrifice, from the need to stand on something that was truly hers, and Daniel nodded immediately, without hesitation, because he had expected this, because it was Exactly who she had always been, even when she was just a child standing in the rain, and he replied simply, "You did," and the certainty in his voice did not try to convince, it did not push, it simply stated something he believed completely. And Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching, not for proof, but for honesty, and whatever she saw there was enough, not to remove every doubt, but to quiet it. To let it settle into something she could accept, and she let out a slow breath, her hand dropping from the bracelet as she straightened slightly, because the moment was shifting again, not ending, but moving forward into something new, something that was no longer just about the past. And as she turned slightly, glancing back at her desk, at the work she had done, at the place she had begun to find her footing again, she realized that whatever had brought her here, she was the one standing in it now. She was the one doing the work, making the choices, building something again. Piece by piece, and that mattered. And when she looked back at him one last time, there was a quiet clarity in her expression, something steady and real, because she understood now that the past had connected them, but it did not define what came next, and somewhere deep inside, something had shifted from uncertainty into possibility, not just for him, but for her, and for the first time. The life she was living did not feel like something she was trying to survive, it felt like something she might actually be able to shape. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, reflective haze for Emily, not because she was distracted, but because everything now carried a deeper layer of meaning, every task, every interaction, every small decision feeling connected to something larger than she had ever considered before, and as she worked, she found herself more focused than ever, not out of necessity, but out of a growing sense of ownership, as if this space, this role, this opportunity was no longer something fragile that could disappear at any moment, but something she was actively shaping with her own hands. And there was a quiet strength in that realization, something steady that settled into her posture, into the way she spoke, into the way she carried herself through the office, and people noticed it, not in obvious ways, but in the subtle shift of respect, in the way conversations paused for her input, in the way decisions began to include her without hesitation. And for the first time in a long while, Emily did not question whether she belonged there, she simply acted as if she did. Because now she understood that belonging was not given, it was built, and she was building it. Piece by piece, just as she had built everything else in her life. And across the building, Daniel stood in a quiet conference room, the glass walls reflecting the movement of the office beyond, and though he had returned to the responsibilities that defined his position, his attention remained partially anchored to the space where everything had shifted, not out of control, but out of care. And when his assistant entered briefly to update him on the day's agenda, he listened, responded, continued forward as expected, but there was a difference now, something less distant in his focus, something that allowed him to see beyond numbers and outcomes into the quiet impact of what he was doing. And when the meeting ended, he remained for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze resting on the reflection of the office floor below, and he understood something with a clarity that did not require further thought. That the moment he had carried for so many years had reached its purpose. Not in being repaid, but in being completed, not by him, but by her, by the way she had stepped into her own life again without knowing she had ever left it. And as the evening approached, Emily gathered her things with a sense of calm that felt new, not rushed, not anxious, but grounded, and when she stepped outside, the air felt different again, not because the city had changed, but because she had, and as she walked toward her son's school, her thoughts moved differently now, no longer circling around doubt or uncertainty, but opening into something wider, something that allowed her to see her own life with a perspective she had not had before. And when her son ran toward her, his face bright with the simple joy that had always anchored her, she knelt down and held him close, her arms wrapping around him with a quiet certainty that made the moment feel complete in a way she could not fully explain. And as they walked home together, she listened to him the way she always had, but there was something deeper beneath it now, a recognition that the small things she did for him every day, the words she spoke, the care she gave, might carry a weight she could not yet see, just as her words had once carried weight for someone else. And the thought did not overwhelm her, it grounded her, it reminded her that meaning was not always visible in the moment it was created, And later that night, as she sat once again at the small kitchen table, the bracelet resting lightly against her wrist, she did not search for the memory this time, she did not force it, because she knew now that it was already part of her. Whether she recalled every detail or not, and she let her fingers rest against it gently, a quiet acknowledgement of something that had come full circle, and across the city, Daniel stood once more by the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, but this time, the distance did not feel vast, it felt connected, because the life he had built no longer stood apart from the moment that had shaped it, it stood as a continuation of it, and as he turned away from the glass, there was no need to hold on to the past in the same way, because it was no longer something he carried alone, it had found its way back into the present, into something real, something shared, and in that quiet understanding, both of them moved forward, not as strangers connected by a forgotten moment, but as two lives that had crossed once, changed, and now, in a way either of them had expected, found their way back to each other with a clarity that did not need to be explained, only lived. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet steadiness that no longer felt fragile, but earned, each day building gently upon the last in a way that made Emily's life feel less like something she was holding together and more like something she was shaping with intention. And the changes were not dramatic, not sudden, but they were real, found in the small moments that carried the most meaning, in the way her son laughed more easily at dinner, in the way she no longer checked her bank account with the same quiet dread, in the way she walked into work not with hesitation, but with purpose. And each of those moments carried a quiet echo of something she now understood, that meaning was not always found in the big events people talked about, but in the small choices that built a life piece by piece. And as she moved through her days, she found herself thinking about that night in the rain less as a distant memory and more as a reminder. Not of what she had done for someone else, but of who she had always been, someone who gave without calculation, someone who saw others even when no one was watching. And that realization changed something inside her, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that allowed her to see her own life with a kind of quiet respect she had not allowed herself before. And across the city, Daniel continued his work with the same precision that had defined him for years. But there was something different now, something less distant in his decisions, as if the clarity he had carried from that single moment had expanded into something wider, something that touched not just one life, but many, and though he did not step into Emily's path as often, did not insert himself into her daily world, their connection remained present in a quieter way, in occasional conversations that no longer felt uncertain, in shared understanding that did not need to be explained. And one evening, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, casting long shadows across the city, they found themselves standing once again in the same space where everything had shifted, not by chance this time, but by quiet intention, and Emily looked at him with a calm that had replaced the uncertainty from before, her voice steady as she spoke. "I remember more now, not everything, but enough," and Daniel nodded, not surprised, not pressing for more, because he understood that what mattered was not how much she remembered, but that she felt it, that the connection had returned in a way that was real to her, and she let out a small breath, her gaze softening slightly as she added, "I still cannot believe something that small could mean so much," and Daniel's expression shifted just enough to carry the truth he had lived with for so long, because sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that change everything, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, not as a lesson, but as something lived, something proven, and Emily smiled then, not out of politeness, not out of obligation, but with a genuine warmth that reflected something deeper than before, something grounded in understanding, and she glanced briefly at the bracelet on her wrist before looking back at him, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "I think I understand now, not just what happened, but why it matters," and Daniel did not respond with words this time, because he did not need to. The meaning was already there, shared without explanation, and as they stood therein, the quiet space between past and present, either of them needed to hold on to what had been in the same way anymore, because it had already done its work, it had shaped them, guided them, and now it had brought them to a place where they could move forward not defined by that single moment, but strengthened by it. And as Emily turned to leave, her steps steady, her path clear in a way it had never been before. She felt something settle inside her, not as a question, but as an answer, something simple and lasting, that the kindness we give without expecting anything in return does not disappear, it becomes part of someone else's story, and sometimes, if we are fortunate, it finds its way back to remind us who we have always been.